All right, welcome to our Pasture and Forages meeting for the Williamson County Master Horse Program. Tonight we have a lot of excellent information that I think is very purposeful and very poignant for almost all of your farms that applies and can help you meet whichever goal you want to have. So the important thing is when I'm coming out on your farm is I want to set a goal with you. And so oftentimes we'll go out on a farm and it'll be 5 acres and somebody has 5 horses on there, and the goal being I want to provide enough forage on my 5 acres for all 5 of my horses to sustain for 10 months of the year. Right there we've automatically set ourselves both up for failure and disappointment if we let that be our goal, because I can't provide you the right information, and if I do, you'll be disappointed with the results. And so first thing we always try to do is work towards a workable goal. In that situation, we can either get rid of 4 of the horses, or we can say, you know what, maybe we can't be able to pull forage off of that 5 acres to be able to feed your horses at all times of the year. So let's come up with a different goal. Nobody's taken me up on getting rid of any of the horses, so I'll continue to work on the second goal of adjusting our expectations for our pastures. But pastures also come with hay, and I try to spend a little bit of time about hay because you're getting ready. Some of you already have done a forage sample. Others may look at doing a forage sample, because I think the next Master Horse class at the state level covers kind of understanding your forage analysis. We're not going to cover a lot of that tonight, but I will handle each one of you on an individual basis that have a forage analysis, so you'll just need to communicate with me. But when you're purchasing hay, which most of us do, there's different things that we're looking at, whether it's the species of the hay that we're getting, whether it's fescue or Bermuda grass or orchard grass, whatever it is. What form are we getting it in? Is it a round bale? Is it a square bale? Palage? The timing. When was it cut? That's a huge and big important factor. And quality. Obviously, quality is a big thing. Is I can give you 2 square bales. They both look green. That doesn't mean that they're the same quality. So we're going to start talking a little bit about that. When we start looking at species, we start to see these are common ones that you see involved in the equine industry. These are popular types. You get a tall fescue. We'll get into that one. That's the most common cool season grass that we have. If you walk out in any type of pasture all throughout Middle Tennessee, most likely you're going to see a tall fescue based pasture. In Middle Tennessee, or Tennessee where we're at, our zone for growing grass is a very awkward and poor zone. For anything that grows really well in the cool seasons, it's too hot in the summer, and anything that grows really well in the warm part of the year, the June, July, it is too cold during the winter. So our grasses struggle. As far as cool season grasses, tall fescue, and which cool season, the way we tell a cool season is if it's green all year long, it's cool season. If it's brown during the winter, like it is right now, it's warm season. So that'd be like Bermuda. So our cool season grass, it's typically there in most pastures, is tall fescue. Another one that we see, orchard grass, that's a very popular horse hay, is orchard grass. It does not do well as a grazing grass. It just does not hold up to grazing. Bermuda is a forage that has a lot less sugar content, so that tends to be a popular hay for Bermuda. It's a little bit wispier. It can lead to some type of colic if you get some really poor quality Bermuda that binds up in there. Another thing that we can look at is Bermuda can be used like with lower sugar content. It does also thrive during the summer. Teff is an annual. This has become a very popular hay. It can only be used as hay. It can't be grazed. It just doesn't stand up to it. It's one of these grasses you plant on an annual basis in late summer or in summer, and it grows really well. It grows really fast. So when you start cutting it, you really have to stay on top of it because it can get out of control pretty quick. But this is another popular horse hay that comes during the summertime. And then alfalfa is a legume. This is one of the most probably important and one of the most popular equine hays there is. And then Timothy. Timothy is one of the probably more important grass hays that you'll see in the equine industry. It's typically grown in cooler climates. It's just too hot down here, so we just don't have very many stands. Sometimes you could get into the cooler sections of the state and might be able to get a stand, but as far as growing it in Middle Tennessee, it just does not grow very well. But it's a very popular hay for a lot of equine owners. And Megan, if you see any questions, just let me know. I see we've got a couple of questions. So, Andrea, teff is an annual grass, and it's got a very thin stem, much like Bermuda grass, and it grows straight up. So what happens is if you don't stay on it quick enough, it starts to fall over on itself. But it has a lot of the properties of Bermuda grass, except it's kind of a taller growing grass. Lower sugar content, that's why a lot of people like it. It produces a good amount of tonnage of actual hay. So when you plant it, you actually get quite a bit of hay harvested off of it. But once you start going with it, you really have to stay on top of it. Or eventually, like I said, if it gets too high, it starts to fall over on itself. But nutritionally content, it's a little bit lower in the sugar content. So some people like it for using it for those easy keepers. And like I said, the more you can keep your horses off of your fescue-based pasture during the summer when it's really hot, you can really start to save some of your pastures. Let's see, I think I saw a chat that has ryegrass. Ryegrass is another popular grass to use. The challenge that we get into some of our annuals, and teff is a summer annual. You have to plant it every summer. And ryegrass is another one which you typically have to plant on an annual basis. They're good quality grasses. They do a little bit better in spring. They obviously don't do well the rest of the year, so they fade out at the end of May. And so that's the biggest issue with that, is you're having to completely replant and utilize some of that. So they may not have as high a nutritional content as some of the others, but sometimes that's a good. And the fact that you don't always want the highest nutritional content in your hay, especially if you've got one of those easy keepers. Let's see here. So form is another way of looking at it. So we have two forms. We have the square bales and we have the round bales. And each one of them is a perfectly acceptable form of doing it. Sometimes the round bales, though, get a negative connotation on that, and that it's a lower quality hay. Most of the time they're baled in the exact same fields. You may get the first cutting is baled, or half that field is baled in round bales, the other half in square bales. It's all about the form that fits what you need. Especially if you've got a little small barn and putting a loft in there, if that's all you have, it's going to be very difficult for you to store very many round bales in there. So that's where a square bale might fit better in your situation. If you've got one horse and you're just feeding him a little bit at a time, square bales probably fits better into what you're looking for. Where the round bales really start to fit in is if you have multiple horses, and depending on the time of year. So if you've got 4 or 5 horses and you're boarding, or you just have 4 or 5 horses out there, and it's during the summer, those horses can eat on that bale, and in a few days, they can probably pretty much consume most of that bale. Where it'd be a hard time is if you put that bale out in the open, and let's say it's in the spring, or more importantly in the winter when we get quite a amount of rain, and you have 2 horses out there, you put that round bale out there, and on the third day it gets rained on, most of that hay is going to be wasted at that point. Those horses just can't consume enough of the hay. So that's where it's better off to maybe have square bales fed, but it just really depends on your situation. If you have like one of those hay saver huts, or you can put that round bale underneath cover and you have a few horses, then that bale is going to work great for you, as long as you're preventing it from getting weathered and getting a lot of that wasted. So it's important to make sure it fits your situation that you have, but both are perfectly quality hay. You want to make sure that they're stored well, they're stored correctly, and they were put up correctly. But depending on what your situation is, both can be perfectly acceptable forms of feeding hay. The timing, and this is kind of where we start to get into things. And so I think it's really important that you guys may have seen this growth, this curve at some point, but this just shows how grass grows. And I believe they talked a little bit about this, so we won't get too much into how the grass grows, but it's important to understand when you're talking about grazing or producing hay, is grass starts by this very small one little blade of grass in the ground, and it has this tiny little root. And so when it's starting to first grow for those first 2 or 3 inches, it's only growing by what it has stored up energy-wise in the ground. And so until it starts to get a good leaf formation and it starts to actually get leaf and surface area on those leaves, it can't catch very much sunlight, which that's how plants grow, sunlight. So as it starts to grow, it starts to get more leaf, and then it starts to be able to catch more sunlight, and then it will start to produce more leaf content, grow, and that's how the plant goes. So in stage 2, this is typically where we are in the growth phase of it. And so we're in the replication. So it's growing, growing, growing. And then towards the top of that growth curve in phase 3, that's when it starts to transition from growth into reproduction. It's starting to produce a seed head. And so now all of the energy and the resources, instead of going to producing high quality leaves, now they're trying to go into reproduction. So all that energy is focused there. So the rest of the plant kind of quits growing. So now that's why you've lost all the nutritional content in those leaves. So you want to make sure when we're cutting hay that you don't have a lot of seed heads, because that indicates that your hay is going to be of lower quality, because that plant has gone from producing growth stage, where it's putting all of it in those lush leaves, to focusing all that energy into those seed heads. So when you see a bunch of seed heads, you know it's kind of going backwards. Ideally, in order to maximize, if I was baling hay, I'd make sure that I had a few seed heads, because I want to make sure I have the highest amount of production of my product, but I don't want to have very many of them. So just kind of look at, when you look at your hay, make sure that you have a reduced amount of seed heads. That indicates your pasture hopefully was put up at the right time. And so when there's a couple looking at, so that's the stage of maturity, the window of baling. So a lot of us have a negative connotation about fescue. So typically when I look at people and talk to people about hay, their favorite being Timothy, which is harder to get. The next favorite being orchard grass, and we're talking about cool season grass hays. And the final would be tall fescue. Believe it or not, nutritional content wise, they're all very, very similar, if not almost identical in a lot of areas. Where you start to see the differences, what makes one maybe better than the other, there is a slight preference, I think, on taste. If you had probably did a taste test, there might be a slight preference on taste, but it's not that one is awful and that one is like eating candy. There just seems to be a little bit of preference there. But more importantly, it's the stage and window at which they were baled. So if you kind of take what the negative connotation is that fescue is the worst. So guess which of these grasses has the smallest window for baling it at the perfect stage? It's fescue. The next one is orchard grass, and the last one is Timothy. So Timothy has the largest window at which you can bale. Well, what do we have in the first cutting being our perfect cutting? It's kind of the best cutting for our cool season forages, because it's coming right out of spring. It's got this nice cool weather. And so the best time to do it is in spring. Well, we either have other jobs going on, the person producing it either has another job going on, or rain is always in the forecast. And so we may have a time when our job demands our time and rain demands our time, and we miss that really small window for fescue. Well, orchard grass might have a little bit longer window, and Timothy has the longest. So that makes a big difference in the timing of the cutting. So if you don't get it cut at the right time, you're going to have a lower quality hay. And then that gets into cuttings. And so obviously for cool season forages, which is mostly what we're selling and utilizing, that first cutting is the best. The earlier you can get that first cutting, so I ask a lot of people is what cutting is it? Because if I was going to be buying a cool season forage and it was produced in Tennessee, I would want to know that it was produced hopefully in the first 2 cuttings. If you can get that first cutting done in mid-May, that allows you enough time, as long as they left enough growth on the forage, that allows us enough time to get that next cutting, hopefully by the end of June. And the key part of this is when fescue starts to shut down or orchard grass starts to shut down because it's starting to get hot and dry. And so the quality is starting to go down. And so hopefully most times by June or early part of June, that rain is still hanging on. The heat hasn't hit its full capacity yet. And so we're still able to get a quality second cutting of our cool season forage. If we get much past that into July, the cool season forage is going down quality-wise, and we're starting to get all of these warm season Johnson grass, beginning of foxtail, sage grass, all these are starting to come on. And so we're trying to beat that window. So I really try to focus in on cool season. Let's try to get those first 2 cuttings in. If you're asking to buy hay, look for hay that was hopefully done in the first 2 cuttings, or be more specific, just kind of ask about them. But if I'm doing it myself, I want to make sure that I try to aim for that window. If it works out, great. If it doesn't, then that's just something for us to consider as we move forward. So typically most cool season grasses, 2 cuttings is about what you get. We'll get a 3rd cutting, but it's going to be probably a lot of it is going to be warm season grasses in there. So check on some questions. Is it possible to seed both cool and warm season grasses in your pastures, and would you do a spring and fall seeding? So I try to focus in on one grass, and typically that's cool season as far as my seeding. Invariably, you're going to get some volunteer warm season grasses that they're going to fill in the gap. So when you seed your cool season forage, over time, you're going to start to get gaps where some of that forage starts to die off. You're going to get things that fill in it. It's either going to be a weed or grass. So you can spray to try to control the weeds. But I don't ever try to seed them together because they just don't play very well together. The cool season grass grows in what we call a bunch. And so when it forms that bunch of grass, it doesn't expand anymore. That's the space it's going to fill forever. So when it dies out, it's gone. Warm season grasses grow what we call rhizomes, and they crawl around on the ground. And so you'll notice if you've got a patch of Bermuda grass in your home lawn or your pasture, if you get a bare patch there, in a few weeks, Bermuda will start to crawl along the ground and fill in those gaps. Same for crabgrass. It'll start to fill in those gaps. And so then you'll have, it kind of keeps itself controlled. So they just don't play very well together. Let's see. Yeah, when it comes to fall forages, asking about what about the leaves in the hay? Are they late cut in the fall? Are they lower quality? They tend to be lower quality, yes, because they are coming out of lower quality compared to spring, higher quality compared to summer. So as those they're getting a little bit less sun, they're getting some of that cooler weather coming on. They don't quite have all of the rain build up yet. So between those combination of 2 things, it is going to be a little bit lower quality than your spring hay or your spring plant, but it is going to be definitely higher quality. You got that really kind of freshening up where you still have some warm days, but it's cooling off at night. And that allows that plant to really start to grow. It's getting a little bit more rain. And so it's going to be a higher quality than the summer. Is there a benefit to leaving the round bales in the field for a few days, weather permitting, or is it best to store right away? That really depends on the time of year that you're cutting it and what is actually inside of that hay. The biggest thing being if you bale it kind of wet, depending on if you have some high moisture weeds like a Johnson grass, it takes some time to dry out, especially when you start cutting it in September or October. it takes a long time for that stuff to dry out. Or if you cut the cool season forage early in the spring and it's really wet, you can, when you bale that, you can get into some really bad issues with those bales heating up, and then you put them in a barn. That's where we get our barn fires. They start from hay bales warming or heating up and causing a fire. So what I recommend is we have a moisture tester, just the same as we have a hay core that you can use to sample. I also have a moisture tester that you can put into the bale to test your moisture, and that tells you the moisture content and the temperature of those bales to let you know when they're safe to put inside. Typically, most people are, if they know that they're wet, they're going to leave them outside for a while until they cool down. One thing that's a very simple thing you can do is buy a moisture probe, and it's probably 18 bucks, 17 bucks on Amazon. It's like you use for compost. You stick it in there in the bale and you just leave it, and you can kind of just watch it, come back there and check it. And when you find out that it's gotten to the right temperature, then you can start to put that back into the barn. But that's typically why we would leave them out, is if we're worried about them having a high moisture content and putting them in too wet and they start to heat up, and that's where we cause a fire. All right. Okay, so this is typically what you're gonna see. We don't call them these. They've changed last year. They've changed how they call these tests. So you're not going to see this test type horse professional, horse pro. It's the basic test, and it's going to give you all the information that you want right there. But this is when we start looking at quality. This is the important part, is to realize that quality is based up on a lot of facts. Visual appraisal is a great one to start with. You know, if it just looks really yellow, that might be a sign that, you know, it was wet and it's dried out. If you can see mold on the outside, you know, it always helps to have a good visual appraisal. You're never going to replace that, but it can't be everything, because sometimes you can look at two really bright green bales of hay and they look good from that angle, but quality-wise, they're completely different. Smell is always important. You can smell mold, and so you want to be able to, you know, look at that, smell that. Weeds kind of give off a sweet. If you got a bunch of weeds in there, they have a sweet smell. But the most important thing is, you know, we just keep hammering home on it, is a forage analysis. The idea is that we don't have to take a forage analysis with the purpose of weeding out all the bad hays. The idea is to take it so we know where we stand today. So when we're doing our nutritional profile or program for our horse, is we know that, okay, I've got a lower quality hay. I need to feed X amount more of some concentrate or something else to meet their needs. It's not that I just need to throw this hay away. And I think that's where most people get kind of confused. It's not to weed out the bad ones. It's to know where we stand. And so there's just no way to tell where we stand by looking at the hay. And sometimes we can be pretty surprised by what we think is a good and a bad hay when the analysis comes back. And so, you know, you're looking at two different types of things here. So if you've got a typical moisture content of a hay should be right around 10% or 90% dry matter, 10% moisture. So this would be considered probably a very typical hay, as far as it's right around 10%. When it's around 30, it's either really, really wet, or more than likely it may be something what we call like haylage or baleage. So this is purposely put up hay that is put up when it's really, really wet and put up into a bag and then sealed up. And that's where we get the anaerobic microbes to start to act on it, breaking it down and preserving it. So it's actually highly consumable by horses. They really enjoy it, especially in cattle, really enjoy it as well. But it takes a little bit more of an art to make sure you're getting it put up correctly, and you'll find out that they will mow through this stuff and you'll burn through a whole bunch of hay really quick in this manner. So that's what that is. So when you look at the RFQ, that means it is, it's a very relative term. Instead of trying to, you know, they tried to come up with some sort of scoring system for hay. It's very difficult to do that. They came up with the RFQ as a simple way of looking at it. You know, if your hay is in this weight range, then it's typically what we call you've got a good quality hay. When we start looking at, so that's where it's 191. So when I start looking at crude protein value, a lot of times that's overrated, but a 9.62 tells me somewhere it's a grass. More likely it's just a quality grass. So that's where we're going to find most of our grasses are going to fall in there between 8 and 11%. So that's a very standard quality grass. I come over here to the 24, and that tells me this is, with it being this high, this is more likely alfalfa. Alfalfa, the legumes, clover, alfalfa have a much higher percentage of crude protein. We're not going to get into a whole lot of this right this second, because I think you're going to cover a lot of this next week. And if we don't cover, or this Thursday, if we don't cover it, we'll come back and we'll talk about each one of them. But one of the few things that we need to remember are ADF and NDF. This is how much, and we talked about this in our anatomy class, this is how much they can consume, and this is how much they can digest. So both of these numbers are definitely within range. This one's really actually pretty low. Typically the range is from 50 to 60, and this is pretty low. So that means they can readily consume a lot of it. And the same goes for some of these others. So we'll get into that. Let me see if we can check the questions here. If warm season grass was used and goes brown in the fall, winter, does this mean the pastures are dead, or a horse able to get some form of nutrition? So from warm season grass, there's really not much nutrition they're getting from any one of our forages during the winter time. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit farther as we go, but that's where horses, they're kind of enacting the habit of grazing, but it's really hard. Winter is just really, really hard on our pastures. So as far as warm season grasses, there's little to no nutrition coming from warm season grasses. They've just basically shut down. They're in maintenance. They are just trying to maintain life mode. Cool season grasses, you know, how many times do you mow your yard during the winter? None. So they're also have shut down. They're just trying to maintain themselves as well. If I was going to say, are you going to get more nutrition from a warm season or a cool season? You are going to get slightly more from the cool season, because they will have some stored up in there, but they're not actively growing. So once you take it the first time around, there's nothing left. It's not going to build back up again. So we don't feed silage. We do feed haylage there is some haylage that is fed to horses. The biggest risk factor, and it's the same for cattle too, is the curing process within the bag. So it's an anaerobic breakdown. So when you seal it, you seal in and you try to keep out the air. And so those microbes then can work on that haylage, and after a while they break it down, and then it's in a stable mode that they can eat. If you were to let air, let's say a raccoon, which a lot of times you'll see that on those outdoor stored baleages or haylages, depending, a raccoon gets in there and scrapes along there, or your kids use it as a gymnastic training center where they're running along top of it. They'll start scraping along the side, they get some holes, and you'll get holes and air into there. And depending on when that process occurs, sometimes you can mess up that process and it becomes a troublesome nutritional issue. As far as being rich, it can be very rich, because you're putting it up, that process is going to have all of that nutrient content that's in there before it's lost due to leaching from the sun and from sitting out there drying out. So you've put it out there and you've kept most of that nutrients in there. So it is going to be pretty rich. They are going to want to consume it. We don't see it a lot just because the process is more difficult, but it is a high quality forage. Most people don't do it because it's finding it for one, and being able to make sure that it's was safely done and put up is another reason. All right. So things I always tell people to look at when you're looking to buy some hay, always look out for blister beetles. And so the situation that I look at for that is ask where the alfalfa came from. So blister beetles are typically in alfalfa. This picture right to the right over here is alfalfa and blister beetles. So where you typically see them is when we have a dry stage or we have a drought and you put up the alfalfa in the drought. And so depending where we're at, so if they said, you know, it came from Illinois and you knew that they just went through a 3-month really, really heavy drought, I might spend some more time making sure that I don't see blister beetles in there. Typically, if you had a very normal rainy season and it's not too dry, then you're not going to see too many blister beetles. If they consume one, it's probably not the end of the world. But be looking out for ones where the alfalfa was put up during a very big drought. Foxtails, I think we saw quite a few people bring up some hay samples over the last week or so that had foxtails in it. There's different stages of foxtails. There's, kind of the right-hand side where it's relatively young. And then as you go further, it starts to mature and gets a little bit harder, more needle-like. And so this is where I was talking about having those cuttings done by the second cutting, because you get into the third cutting. This is where foxtail is going to come on. By early August through mid-September, if you're putting up hay, it more than likely has foxtail. And foxtail is really a tricky weed, and actually quite a few of our weeds are pretty tricky. So let's say at 2 foot tall, the foxtail starts to put off that seed head. So you said, okay, I'm going to get ahead of you. So when you're 18 inches tall, I'm going to come through and mow it. So you do it. 2 weeks later, that foxtail starts to grow. And guess what? At 18 inches, it puts off a seed head instead of 2 feet. It's adapted. You come through, okay, I'm going to get you at 12 inches. Come through next time, 2 weeks later, it's got a seed head at 12 inches because it just keeps adapting to situations because it's adapting to survive. So it's very, very hard to control, hard to get rid of. So my thing is if you have some, try to make sure that it looks like it's been put up there and it's relatively immature and kind of soft. If they've got a few pieces in there, they'll pick through it and throw the rest on the ground. If they don't have a choice and that's all they have to eat and there's a whole bunch of it, they'll eat it. And then that's kind of where you start to see some of those horses that have like those little needle mouths all over their gums. So you just can't control it when it gets into late August, September. So try to aim for getting some hay that's produced in the first couple seasons. And if you are buying the third cutting, you just make sure that you don't have an overwhelming amount of this stuff. And the same goes for sage-grass. Sage-grass, it's starting to come on in August, September, October. It is really hard to produce any hay without sage-grass. And so that's one of those things where, when it's only a couple, it's 2 or 3 inches tall, 4 or 5 inches tall, it's okay grass. You're putting up when it's relatively immature, so it's going to be a little bit lusher. As it starts to get taller, that's when you start to lose all the nutritional value. It just becomes a stem. And horses, if you buy hay like that, they're just going to pick through it, throw it all on the ground, and so you're paying the same price for that hay as you do, good hay. Or you're paying a lesser price, and they only eat about a quarter of it, so you have to buy 4 bales for every 1 good bale of hay. That's where a lot of people get caught on, is they're looking to buy the lower or the cheapest hay, and so but they'll end up spending 4 times the amount because that's what it'll take, because they'll just keep weeding through it and then getting rid of all the bad stuff, and so you'll be stuck paying the same price. How does foxtail feel to touch? Well, some of it can be very very soft. And, if you get an immature foxtail, it can be pretty soft. And so it may not have the really sharp needles. If you get one that's more mature, it's been out in the field a little bit longer, it's going to feel kind of like needles on your hands. So it kind of depends on when that plant was harvested on how it's going to feel. So it goes anywhere from very soft to very, very needly. neither one is palatable. And then botulism. Botulism is, well, invariably we see this probably once a year at least. I'm sure the Dr. McInturf or Dr. Kimmons or Dr. Wooten or any one of those at any one of our vet clinics probably have a story to tell at least each year of a horse potentially dying of botulism or having to be treated for botulism. This is being aware of your hay. So this is typically where an animal or a dead animal was baled up into the hay, and that it's kind of, as it decays, it leaches into that hay, and that's what causes the botulism. The other thing would be that we sometimes see is you get a dead animal and you set a round bale on top of you're setting them outside, and you set the round bale on top of it, and that dead animal kind of leaches into the bottom of that bale and then is consumed by the horse. It's one of those things you got to get, if you notice anything, the staggers, you've got to get them right there to the clinic right away because they only have a short window where they can actually treat this and be effective. So if you do notice it, but just be very aware. Once again, that visual appeal, that smell, be very aware of what's going on in your hay. So this is probably what most of our pastures look like right now. Maybe on Sunday, it'll be a frozen tundra, but this is probably what most of them look like. And so now where do we go from here? And so here. Is the vaccine for botulism effective for this type of botulism? Typically, it's not terribly effective. It's not going to hurt. There may be a slight bit of help, but for the most part, it's not going to prevent botulism. So there's just not a perfect cure for botulism. All right, so this is what our pastures are going to start to look like in early spring. So we're going to talk about mid-March. We're getting that warm-up period. So that pasture we just looked at that was late winter still has these gaps, those same gaps of grass. Grass didn't improve any, grass didn't take off any, but now we're starting to get some weeds that are starting to pop up in between and all these little bare spots where that mud was at. So that's what our pasture is going to start to look like. And then very quickly, mid-April, late March, April, somewhere, we get these beautiful wildflower patches. And if you have one of these, I recommend contacting a local photographer because they love these, and you might as well get some value out of this pasture because that is the extent of what it will be. You will get a beautiful picture for your family and for the local photographer. So enjoy that from that perspective. But that's the only value to a pasture like this. And this will happen invariably wherever you have gaps in your pasture. If there's not some type of weed control method, you're going to get gaps like that. So the question was asked, so when's the best time to reseed here? So I think I'm going to get right into that. And if I don't answer it in the next few slides, then we'll come back and loop around to that question. So yeah. So how do we prevent our pasture from looking like this? Okay, so the key to all this is competition. Ultimately, whether we're spraying herbicides or not, or use mowing, the best way to control weeds is by having a perfect pasture. Competition. So the more grass you can have, it can out. If you put them, two grass and weeds in a weight room, grass is going to defeat the weeds as long as there's a good amount of grass there, as long as they got a team of people in there. If you start to get where you've got more weeds than grass, the weeds are going to take over. So make sure that the ultimate goal in our whole pasture production is having good competition to overtake the weeds. So they're going to need all these types of things. So I believe they went over most of this, but so we're going to just hold off on the different types of forage species because I think we've talked about most of these. We talked about a lot of those. So this is kind of the growth curve. I always like to show these. So sometimes that we want to grow these independently, and sometimes we want to be able to grow them together. And so you look at, this is how a cool season, so fescue, orchard grass, alfalfa, some Timothy would grow like this. So by early March, it's starting to take off. By mid-May, it's peaked. And by end of June, it is kind of gone down and it's plummeted at the bottom. And it just barely wants to survive to live until we get to that next fall season where it's starting to cool off at night, getting some more rain, and it's going to start peaking again. Not going to peak as high as the spring, and then it's going to come back down. And so and it's going to go kind of dormant for the most part in the end of November. Vice versa, you get something like Bermuda, it is dormant from November, January, February, March, April. It starts to come alive by early May. It's starting to get a little kick. It's warming up. June, July, end of July is when it really peaks. August, September, it's starting to come down. And then once we get that first heavy frost, that's when your warm season goes down. So some of us, you want to try to maintain one over the other. So if you're having a warm season pasture, obviously you have, what do I do with these other gaps on each one of these ends from November to December, January to April? Well, this is where you could come in and overseed an annual. So you could come in with like a ryegrass or something and overseed that. And so that would allow us to fill in those gaps until we got till May, where our warm season grass starts to come along. The same comes up here to the cool season. What do we do about these other gaps? Well, you really can't overseed ryegrass into another cool season like fescue, because they're going to try to grow at the same time, and one may overtake the other. But what you can do is maybe during this one lull in June, July, August, September, is have maybe one of your pastures be warm season. So you can kind of overlay these two on top of each other. So you have, let's say you have 4 paddocks and 3 of them are cool season, and maybe you have one that is warm season. So most of the time during the summer, maybe they spend their time on that warm season paddock, and during the rest of the time of the year, between the spring and the fall, they get to spend it on the cool season. And so that helps us really maximize our 2 forages. So coming over here, what is the best weed control for buttercups and other weeds? And I think, Steve, we're going to get ready to get into that here really shortly. And what height should pastures be mowed to control weeds? And so that's a good question as well. What I typically say is weeds are always going to try to grow, and they're always going to try to adapt to the mowing height. Their ultimate goal is to survive. So if we only use mowing as a way of weed control, we're always just going to be on top of trying to mow to control, because when we start at 12 inches, they're going to start putting seed heads on at 9 inches and moving through. So more importantly, if we go back to where we were at, is our ultimate goal is competition. So the thicker we can keep our grass stand, the better it will help us to keep control of the weeds. So ultimately the question would be is, what height should we mow our grass so that grass stays the healthiest, and so it can have the most competition? And so to answer that question, I would say about 3 inches is as low as I would like to go with my grass. Now, we're speaking in ideal world terms, but that is the point at which when it goes below 3 inches, it starts to convert where it's using its energy from its roots instead of actually catching it from the leaves. And so when it's catching it from the leaves, it grows much, much faster, so it recovers faster. If it's growing from the roots, it takes a long time for that plant to really start to grow and before it can turn over into like photosynthesis. So I like to keep it above 3 inches. The same would be if I'm producing hay, I'd try to raise my hay mower as high as I possibly can, just so my hay recovers quicker. But same goes for pastures. Try to keep it above 3 inches. It will recover quicker and it will provide more competition. So if not, what I say for the weeds is If you can keep them from going to flower or seed stage, especially flower stage, that keeps them from going into seed, and that keeps them from producing more seed on an annual basis. I hope that helped there. So a few recommendations when you're looking at which ones to plant. Obviously, fescue. Fescue is what I'm going to recommend almost every time for every situation outside of those with brood mares. Brood mares, fescue, the fescue we have is extremely harmful to not only to the brood mare, but to the foal. We get kind of these red bag pregnancies, and oftentimes you'll see you'll lose one or both the foal and the mare. So we say minimum, I pull them off the last 3 months of gestation. You might even pull them off a couple months before that. But you don't want to feed them any type of fescue hay or pasture because it stays, the endophyte stays inside of the fescue, whether it's hay or it's pasture. So if you've got a broodmare, perfectly fine to feed them during the first part of gestation. But during those, when that foal is really being developed, the last 2 and really definitely the last 3 months of gestation, she needs to be off of that. But it's no other problem for any other horses. We see reduced gain in cattle, but we don't see that. We're not trying to put pounds on horses like that. But it's very important. I know one of the comments that was made at the last pasture presentation was about what we call this novel endophyte, or if you are looking to produce or go to the feed store and produce and buy any seed, or go to any type of seed company, they have what we could call this novel endophyte. So the reason why fescue is able to survive here, why I always recommend it, it has this endophyte in it that allows it to survive and withstand our really hot summers. It can withstand grazing, it can withstand some of the longer periods of drought because of the endophyte. But that's also what causes our problems. So they actually have developed, they found this what we call novel endophyte, which is, it's an endophyte in the grass, but it's actually positive, it helps. They actually found one in New Zealand. But what we found is it just does not, if you were to plant a field of endophyte, of this novel endophyte in your pasture, but let's say somebody else has it, let's say somebody else in the neighborhood doesn't, which would be nearly everybody in Middle Tennessee or Tennessee, doesn't have this novel endophyte. If birds fly over, if you take a mower from one field to another, if you move hay from one pasture to another, and you start to move the seed from the positive, from the negative into the positive, invariably, it only takes a small percentage of that hay or that seed to overtake this novel endophyte. And so you may have a field that is 85% novel endophyte and 15% of this normal Kentucky 31 endophyte that has the endophyte in there. And you're going to see the same results with that mare. And the seed is about 4 times as high. So it's one of those things, the technology is great, and I would recommend it in a situation where you were completely isolated from anybody else and you weren't moving any type of other fescue hay, or even remotely moving any type of fescue hay into that area, or any type of seed, then it might be well worth your investment. The rest of the time, it's just, there's too many things going wrong with it to be able to look at as a viable option. Yes, donkeys included as far as fescue. All right, so soil test, this is the biggest key we talk about outside of trying to maintain your pastures. It's like you going to the doctor. The doctor doesn't prescribe anything to you without doing tests, because we can't tell what's going on inside of your body. We can get an idea. I can look at the ground, I can look at what's growing and have some sort of an idea what I think might be going on. But like your doctor, he doesn't stop there. He goes, what's the first thing he said is, we're going to order some blood work. And so what do? You go down and get the blood work. You don't think a second about it because you know that that's how he's going to tell what's going on inside of your body. No different than on the pasture. We're going to come out there, we're going to look at it and go, this is what I think's occurring. But first thing is, I'd like to order a soil test because I want to know what's going on inside of that ground that I can't see or tell. So we'll order a soil test. And so what that's going to do is give us an idea of what's actually in the ground. And the key is we need to make sure that we have the right balance, right health balance for our plants. And so what's the number one thing that we need? We need lime. Lime is the number one thing because we need the right pH. If you don't have the right pH, you don't have harmony for the grass, you don't have the right balance. And so we got to make sure that that pH is correct. So invariably, we want to make sure that is correct because if it's the right pH, then our grass grows well. If it's a low pH, then our weeds grow well. So we want to put our grass in the best possible manner we can moving forward. So we've got to get the right environment. Then if we do put some other ingredients on the ground, we do put some nitrogen to help it grow, that grass can really utilize it. If it's not the right pH, it doesn't utilize it. It's just like, if you try to give yourself different vitamins, if you've got another imbalance, those vitamins aren't necessarily going to help you like you need them unless your body has the right balance going on with inside of it. So if we do get the right soil environment, the right pH, we have the best chance to be able to get a pasture that looks like the one on the left versus the one on the right, where the weeds can really take over. So the key is whether you spray or you don't spray, competition is the key. When I talk about spraying, I look at it, it is the quickest way for you to get from point A to point B. Can you get to point B by doing the mowing method? You can almost get to point B. It won't look as good as point B with the other one because you're continually you have weeds that are continually adapting. So it's going to be very hard to completely defeat them. But manners at which you can are trying to mow as much as you can to reduce the seed heads and trying to constantly reseed and not overgraze. And so keep your grass in the ultimate health and competitive balance, you'll have a better shot. Spraying just allows us to get to that step a little bit quicker because we eliminate one of the foes. So answer this question. So so how often should soil tests be done? And I think you guys have probably caught on to, I'm really bad at giving you an exact answer. And that I do feel bad about, but it's not an exact answer. So if in general, if you just ask me to throw a date out there, I'd say every 5 years, if you're on a pasture. If you are doing hay and you're taking off the entire amount of hay each and every time, or if you're putting a lot of nitrogen on your pastures or your hay, I would say you're probably looking at 3 years. And so the reason why I do that is the more nitrogen you put on something, the more you're going to see the plant utilizing it. And so it's going to be utilizing nutrients. And so it's going to be dropping that pH. The less nitrogen, it's not going to be growing near as much. And so it's not going to be utilizing nutrients near as much. And so it's not going to grow near as fast. So the soil pH isn't going to change quite as quickly. If I was cutting hay and putting nitrogen on, and cutting 2 or 3 cuttings a year off of it and putting nitrogen on at least once or twice a year, I'd be looking at every 3 years because every time you take all of that hay off there, you're taking everything back out. When you're on a pasture, you'll notice that the horses don't eat completely all of the pasture, and they actually deposit some of that stuff right back onto the pasture. So with some of those nutrients are still going back into the ground. So that's why I say it's a little variable on the soil test, but I would say 5 years being a general one if nothing else was occurring. But if we're being pretty active in what we're doing to it, maybe 3 years. at the lowest point. I don't think you need to get too much lower than that. If not, there's probably an issue going on. Okay, we talked about, this is kind of how how the weeds grow. They get on to, they're kind of stagnant January, February, March, early April, and then they really start to come on. The thing is, they're sitting there in December, January, February, March. Those weeds are sitting there. They're ready to go. And so that's when they start to bloom. Once you see those nice, pretty flowers, you're in trouble. It looks beautiful, but they've already begun the seed production. And so now next year, you're going to have nice, pretty flowers again. So you got to be able to control them. And so when's the perfect time to control cool season weeds? So when we first get those first warm-ups in this spring, so it maybe towards the end of February, if we're hopeful, we'll get some of those warm days. So I'm looking for warm days being 60 degrees and above. Anytime you get times like 4 days in a row where we get an ambient temperature of 60 degrees, that's a trigger for me to say, hey, if I'm going to spray, that's the temperature I need, because you need those weeds actively growing. If you go out there and spray a weed right now, it's just sitting there, nothing's occurring. And so it's not taking that chemical into the root system and actively using it. So that's how chemicals work, is the plant has to actually be growing during that time. And that it actually grows, it absorbs it, and it starts to put it down through its root system. And then that's what kills it, is the actual growth. So if you just put it on there when it's either really, really, really hot, or during the winter time when it's not growing, it just sits there, won't have any activity on it. So 2 times that we can do it. Definitely when you start to get it in the warm-up period of early spring. The other period is, and this is really telltale for buttercup, you can really start to make an impact, is if you get 4 60-degree days in the winter, you can go out there and spray and control buttercup with something like 2,4-D, and I think we'll get into that a little bit. But the key is you got to have 4 60-degree days in a row. But frequently, at least over the last 7 years or so, we have had some period in late November, December that we've been able to to spray during that time. So you need to look at kind of check those windows and be ready to go if you see one of those windows coming. If not, you can come into that March time. The challenge being is the weather doesn't always cooperate. So we may get into a rainy season and you can't get out there, and all of a sudden, before you know it, you've got a bunch of yellow flowers. So, but you're going to be looking at that early March. But 60 degrees is the trigger point for some of these chemicals in these plants. Warm season, you're going to be looking at this little white window here, June. And so you're going to try to spray in late June, early July. They're starting to grow here. And so where it's really effective is to come in late June, early July. Once they've gone to flower or to seed, that's where, yes, you can kill the plant, but it still produces the seed that's going to be there for next year. So you are eliminating it. That's good. But overall, you're going to have to come back and do it again next year. You're probably going to have to do it anyway, but the less seed you can control, the more seed you can control, the less spraying you would have to do, or mowing that may be. So make sure you kind of get in on that. The thing about summer weeds is they produce a ton of seed. So you may spray in early July and then turn around and see a whole bunch of weeds in August and think that your chemical didn't do its right job. But they actually just produce so much seed that you have to come back in and spray again, or continually mow again. Okay, so Andrea, or a question was brought up about spraying, and so with bees. And so the key with that is that is a delicate situation, is trying to involve what we spray and how we spray. There is a balance with that, because that is one of the big considerations is our bee population. That's one of the big things that we have. The challenge with that is trying to adapt our spray techniques. And there are a lot of spray techniques that have been developed, and that might be a class that we can spend a little bit more time in. But when spraying, it's trying to be considerate of bees. And by doing that, you look at what weeds that you're spraying for. What weeds are we considered popular food or plants for bees? Also, what time are you spraying if you are going to spray? When we spray, you have to look at when is the active time for bees. Well, typically the bees are active during the big part of the day when it's sunny, they're out foraging. So if you were looking at trying to do that, it would be spraying very early in the morning or in the evening after they've already returned, preferably after they've already returned to their, to the hive. You can come back in and try to spray some of those weeds. You need to make sure of what time of year. So if you're doing it in late summer, you don't want to spray too late when we get kind of a temperature inversion. And so that allows some of these chemicals to kind of get up and move because of the humidity. So you want to be very careful about when you're trying to spray. But there's a lot of considerations and factors to be made when looking at spraying, because there are multiple things trying to survive and live in a lot of our environments. So Andrea, thank you for bringing that up. And there's probably a lot more that we could get in on that. And maybe that's be something we can do for a little pop-up session on training to spray around and different types of chemicals to use with bees if there is going to be type of spraying. Okay. All right, let's see. Do I have to worry about my pond if I spray 2,4-D? Okay. Typically, 2,4-D is actually used on a lot of pond weeds to be able to do. It is a contact. It has to hit the actual pond, the weed, to be able to break it down. And so what the biggest thing is the weeds that are in your pond are the bigger issue. So when you spray the weeds, they start to die off. And that's when you get the decaying of that matter, that's when you get the breakdown and changing of the environment of the pond. It's not necessarily the active ingredient that comes from the chemical like 2,4-D. It's more about the activity that it has on the weeds or the grasses that are vegetation that is in that pond. So 2,4-D, do I recommend pouring 2,4-D into a pond? Certainly not. Most of the time it's going to break down before it even gets there if you're doing it on a field next to it. But it also is one of those chemicals that is labeled to be used on and directly for plants that are vegetation in the pond. All right, so that one is just really kind of knowing what weed you have. I have two different fields of beautiful yellow flowers. One's buttercup, one's bitter sneezeweed. They each occur at totally different times of the year. One occurs in April, the buttercup. Bitter sneezeweed, that is in July, August, September. If I tried to say, okay, Matt, what time of the year do I need to spray so I can get rid of all these weeds? I couldn't give you one answer because there is not one herbicide, there's not one mowing technique that you can do to be able to control both of these weeds by doing it just one time. It's kind of like the life cycle. That's why we're kind of giving you this information. They each grow at different times. And so buttercup comes up and then you'll see that plant go away probably by early June or mid-June at the latest. It's gone away. So, in most of our herbicides, if they are using them, they are a contact herbicide. They actually have to make contact with the plant. If they don't make contact with the plant, they're not going to kill anything. So when you have buttercup, you have to spray early March to be able to control it. Bitter sneezeweed, you have to spray or mow, whatever it may be. You have to try to do that in mid-July or late June, somewhere in there to help control some of those weeds. So there is no one magic bullet that controls both of these. So part of it is just identifying what you have, knowing that they grow at different seasons. So don't have that's one of those things with goals. Don't have an expectation that you did something in one season that it's going to control it for every season and for many years. So it's a constant adaptation, just like the environment is. It's always adapting and changing. So you have to as well. But know that you're not alone in the battle. The same here. 2 different weeds: buckhorn plantain, curly dock. Herbicides. If you're going with a herbicide versus mowing, 2,4-D will control curly dock. It won't control buckhorn plantain. And so you can't use necessarily just the same herbicide to control all weeds. You got to know what weed you have to be able to control. So that's where you can help. You can get help. You can submit pictures online to our website, and they come directly to me, and I can help identify what it is. Sometimes I can say like, hey, just good grazing can control this, or a good stand of grass will knock it out. And others, I may say, hey, it's a good sign that maybe you need a soil test, or the only way that you're going to get rid of this plant and it's just going to keep on growing is to do something, either to dig it up, to till it up, or to spray. So if you know what that is, which I can help with that, if you know what that is, then it'll help you maintain your pasture a little bit better. So your treatment options. So 2,4-D is your cheapest treatment option when it comes to our herbicides. If you're going to use that option, it's by far the cheapest. If you use it at the lowest rate, you can actually maintain your clovers. Anything above the lowest rate of 2,4-D and any one of these other herbicides, you'll lose all of your clovers in your pasture. But 2,4-D is the cheapest. It will control buttercup at the lowest rate if you get it when it's relatively small. So most of these things will control a lot of these weeds if you get them when they're very small. If you get to flower stage, it's going to be very hard to control at the lowest rates, or sometimes even at the higher rates. So making sure that you can get weeds when they're young, when they're just starting up, will allow you to reduce your herbicide use. Grazon is another one, and I think I talked a little bit about this, but we're going to talk about it now. It's got a broader range of chemicals that are weeds that it will actually control, but this is important for those of you that are buying hay. Not necessarily if you're using it, but if you're buying hay, it's important that you ask. They should tell you, but I always ask anyway, just for the sake of it, is if Grazon Next or Grazon was used on your hay, if you plan on using the horse manure to put on your garden, or any of the hay to put on your garden or something like that. Grazon Next has a little bit of a residual, which is great in the fact that you could spray something, and when I said it's a contact, it has to be actually on the plant. Well, it leaves a little bit of residual in the ground, so if there's a weed coming up right after that for the next 30 days, it helps control that. But with that is if you spray hay on it, it stays in that hay. So let's say your horses eat the hay, they defecate out, you clean up the manure, and then you decide that you're going to put that on your garden. You will not have tomatoes for a couple of years probably. And so it stays with it. If you put that hay on your garden, it's going to kind of come out of the garden or out of the hay onto the garden, and you won't have that. So I always ask, make sure I have that. Make sure I ask. If you're not going to be using it for the manure for anything, doesn't matter. It's only a matter if you're going to try to grow something like clover or tomatoes or legumes of some sort right after that. The broadest weed control and most expensive is Pasture Guard. Does a great job in a lot of areas, but it is by far the broadest and the most expensive one that we have out there. So non-treatment. So this is a very popular method. Like I said, the difference between using a herbicide and not is it gets you from point A to point B much quicker and allows you probably a much better success rate that you can't get with non-treatment methods. That's okay. certainly herbicide is not the end-all be-all solution to every situation. And so what I always say, the same as like with going with organic versus non-organic, is it's a matter of workload and effort. And so when you make that decision to go organic, or you make that decision to not use herbicides, it just means you need to stay on top of the game a little bit better, and a little bit, you're going to spend a little bit more time trying to accomplish that goal. And so if you keep in mind, the ultimate goal is competition. So really controlling grazing management, really controlling, make sure your grass is not stressed out, that it's not overgrazed, not beat into the ground. When it's hot, you get off of it. When it's cold and winter and raining, you get off of it. Is just keep that grass as thick as possible. So don't overgraze. You want to keep that grass as thick and going as possible. Soil test regularly. You need to make sure that that you have the right environment. Remember, if it's a pH of 6 and above, it's great for grass, poor for weeds. If it's a pH below 6, it's great for weeds. So soil test regularly, make sure that that pH is correct. I didn't put this one on here, but we talked a lot about it. Mowing. Try to keep those weeds from going to seed as much as possible. That will reduce the amount of weeds you have. Constantly reseeding, continually reseeding your grass. And then wherever you start to get some gaps at, come back in with a little clover. Clover is great. It's going to add some protein content to your pastures. It's going to add some nitrogen, so you'll get better growth out of that. And so I really like utilizing clovers in my pasture for a multitude of reasons, but it also provides ground cover. So instead of the weeds growing there, you get nice clover growing. So can it be done? Absolutely. You're gonna have to work and continually be active in the maintenance of this pasture, but it's definitely a good option for a lot of people. Can you fertilize and spray 2,4-D at the same time in March, or should these occur separate? No, they're two totally different times. Oftentimes, you'll come in and spray. You might spray first, and because you really want to catch those weeds before they really start to take off, and then you may wait to fertilize a little bit later in the spring. So maybe you come in there in early March with your spraying, and then you come in a little bit later into March with that first shot of nitrogen, because you want a little bit of moisture in the ground. You want it to be warming up, so when those plants are really, really actively growing. The thing about nitrogen is when we put it in the ground, whether it's manure or it's like an inorganic form, that it's only there for a short period of time. It volatilizes, it leaches into the ground and goes away. So if that grass doesn't utilize it right away, poof, it's gone. So like when we put horse manure out on a winter pasture, a lot of times that manure is gone, or that nitrogen is gone before the grass can ever utilize it. Now we're still putting some other nutrients in the ground when we do that, but we are not getting the nitrogen aspect of it. And so the question is, why do they ask if there's clover in the hay for the forage test? And so that gives them an idea if you get a higher protein content, if it was because of a pure stand of grass, they might look at it and go, okay, is this just a really good quality grass? Versus if you tell them, hey, there's clover in it, they'll know, okay, if I got a higher protein content, that there's a good chance that there was some protein in that. So it's a better way to evaluate the hay that we can't necessarily see. So if I saw that you had a 15% protein in your hay, I would more likely guess that say, hey, you've got some clover in it. But if you said absolutely, and I walked out there to your pasture and there was no clover, I would know you just had this really, really freaky, really good quality grass hay. Not likely. Most likely it's going to be because there was clover in there. So it just helps them give more information with the analysis. Okay. And this goes really well with bees. And so when we talk about good spraying makes good neighbors, be careful of drift, be careful what's going on around you. Don't spray at the wrong time when it's really windy. Don't spray when it's really, really, really humid, because things have an ability to pick up and actually move. Be considerate of runoff areas where, you know, you're at the top of the hill, your neighbor is down at the bottom of the hill. You spray something and it kind of runs down to the bottom. Let's say that he has, you know, grazon, and he has a whole bunch of clover. You spray grazon at the top, he's got a bunch of clover at the bottom, and it kind of drifts down there and kills all his clover. So beware what's going on, communicate with each other, certainly. Same with the grazon and the hay movement, but be considerate of your neighbors with bees. And Megan can probably give us some information, and she can probably provide a link in our next website, but there is a website for the TDA, Tennessee Department of Ag has a website where you can see where all the bees are at in the state. So everybody that has a hive is supposed to report that they have a hive. And so you can be aware of what your neighbors have going on. So you can have a conversation with them if you know you've got one within a few miles of there. Have a conversation what your plans are to do, and you guys can be working together. Obviously, a lot of the things that we do are joint, and we're not individual in any one of them. So we are in this together. So Megan, if you can remind us, we'll share that link. Be nice just to check it out, see where some of those bees are, and you also might be able to find some local honey. So we just talked about this. This is the ideal growth range. So the ideal range to have your cool season grass is between 3 and 9 inches. 3 inches and below, and it's trying to utilize energy from its roots. 9 inches and above, it's getting ready, and this is rough, but 9 inches above, it's starting to go from growth stage to reproductive stage, so the quality is starting to go down. That's where you start to see phase 3, quality starting to go down. We want to keep it in that phase 2 as much as possible. So this was just my way of adding a little color into the picture. If you like stats and all this stuff, then great, you could probably read this better than I can. But what I do is to put all this is to tell a story. And there's a lot of questions about you know, sugar content in hays, which hay should I get? When should I be grazing my horses? My horse is an easy keeper and is always foundering and everything like that. So my recommendation is to understand how grasses grow, and then you can make the best decision. So if you know that grasses grow by photosynthesis, they're taking in sunlight, and then once they've captured enough sunlight, they turn around and kind of sit down like we do after dinner. We eat a big meal and we go sit down and let it digest. So we sit down, the plant sits down after capturing all that sunlight, and then it starts to utilize all that energy. So if you understand how that works, you understand when's the best time to graze my horse, when my plants have the lowest sugar content. So the first would be spring is going to have a higher sugar content than summer or than fall. Okay. So if we know that I need to be a little bit more on top of things in the spring and the fall than in the summer, and more importantly in the spring than anywhere else. So you're going to have to manage more during the spring, because that's where we have a lusher green up. And so we have a higher sugar content. But if it goes just by the day, and by the way, plants grow. So if they wake up in the morning and they go, okay, I'm going to start taking in sunlight. So all day long they take in the sunlight. What is the highest point in time with their sugar content? It's in the evening. So late afternoon and evening, they have hit their peak amount of sugar. And so now all through the night, they're going to start to digest and they're going to utilize that energy. And so that's when it's at their highest point. By early morning, that's at their lowest point, because they've utilized all that all night long. They've used it to grow. And so they're at their lowest point to be able to move forward. So at that point, that's probably the best time. If you've got an easy keeper and you're really worried about sugar content, try to graze them in the early morning and then pull them off, okay? Because that is when the plant has the lowest content. In the evening, that's when it's at the highest content. So that's when you don't want to be turning your horses out, because that's at the peak period of their sugar content. A lot of times we see the opposite. We see everybody, they turn them out at night and then they keep them in all throughout the morning and day. But think about it the opposite way. Think about how the plant grows. So in the morning is the best time and the evening is the worst time. So just kind of looking at, I think we talked a little bit about this Bermuda grass this way, is the warm season, they're very fast growing. They adapt to what we have going on, which is hot and dry. They love it. They take a little bit more weed control. They have low input. So you don't have to put near as much effort into keeping them alive during that hot period of the year. So fescue, orchard grass, if you've got a lawn, you know this. If you've got a fescue lawn, you're just having to water that 24/7 to keep it alive during the summer. You don't have this with warm season. Disadvantage is obviously, you don't have this small window when you can actually graze and actually pull nutrients off of it, and then controlling it. It can get out of control pretty quick, because we talked about earlier is you have a clump of fescue grass, it doesn't expand anymore. It stays right there at that point. The only way to expand it is to plant new seed in the ground. Bermuda grass runs by what we call these little rhizomes down here, and that's how it grows. And so it'll start running along the ground and it'll start shooting stems and leaves up off the ground. So it can fill in gaps where a plant dies, it will quickly fill in those gaps. Getting in just really into the nutrition. So try not to get too much into this because we talked about this, but rotational grazing. This is the best way that I have to come up with a goal to maintain your pastures, is to do some type of nutrition or rotational grazing. We know that our cool season grasses do really well in spring and summer, or spring and fall. They do really poorly in the summer and the winter. What does really well during the summer are warm season grasses. So if we can set it up where we are trying to keep our grasses from being stressed out. So what the key is, stressed out is when they're below 3 inches, they're not catching enough sunlight, so they're not getting enough energy, so they really have a hard time growing. During the summer or during the spring, we can rotate them pretty quickly because it's cool, they're getting a lot of rain, and it's recovering very, very quickly. And so our grasses go from 3 inches to 6 inches to 9 inches in a period of a week. And so we can keep horses on there all the time, or be moving them between pasture 1 and pasture 2 all the time. You get to summer and you've got your ruler, your walking stick out there, and you've got a stick in the ground that says, okay, it's at 7 inches. I'm going to go ahead and graze it. And in a period of a week, they've grazed pasture 1 down to 3 inches. So okay, I'm gonna move them off it. You move them to pasture 2. It's at 7 inches. They graze it down to 3 inches in 1 week. And you come back to pasture 1, and maybe it's only because it's not raining and it's really, really hot, it's only grown 1 inch during that time. And so you can only leave them on there for a day, and they've already grazed it down to 3 inches. So if you left them on there for a week, they might graze it all the way down to 1 inch. So instead of putting them back on from pasture 2 to pasture 1, we might try to move them to pasture 3. And so the period of time at which you could put them back on there is all dependent on the season and how well that grass is growing. If it's really stressed during the summer, then you may not want to bring them on that quick. The hard part is a lot of us don't have enough paddocks to be able to have full-on grazing and have 3 or 4 different paddocks. And so what it has to come to is just, what is your goal going to be with it? Because if I want pasture 2 is the front of my house, I have 2 back pastures, 1 and 4 are my back pastures, and I don't care as much what they look like. Pasture 2 is the entrance to my home, and I've got a lot of neighbors and they care about what pastures look like. I might use pasture 2 as my trophy pasture. And my trophy pasture, I like my horses to be out there. It looks good when I come home to see them in there. I only put them out there for a few hours, every few days or something like that, because I want it to look good. I want it to look good as the front entrance to my home. So I may wear out pasture 1 and pasture 4 because I don't have any other choices. But pasture 2, I'm going to try to manage it the best that I can, of pulling them off when I need to, of putting them on when I need to. And so it's going to be managed like a trophy. Pasture 1 and pasture 4, they're just going to be kind of a little bit of a sacrifice lot. So it all depends on what goals we have. Each and every person has a different goal and a different farm and a different layout. And so we can develop one of those for each person, but it's really a case-by-case basis. But that's just an example of what type of goal you may have. So when you're looking right here, this is probably what most people look at. I'll walk out and, over a phone call, I'll ask, well, how's your pasture looking? Oh, it looks great. And they're looking at this area inside the red. And so I've got a whole bunch of patches of this really, really nice, lush, beautiful pasture. And then there's all these little spots around here, like the blue squiggly lines. It's just kind of grazed to the ground, and there's nothing there. But when you look at it, you go, hey, there's still a lot of great pasture. My pasture's in great shape. What can you tell me? We'll come out there and look at it, and I'll see that on every farm. And then this is kind of what I see. So I have all these manure piles, and everywhere there's a manure pile, there's a big clump of grass. And so what happens here is you get a manure pile here, and they won't graze within 3 or 4 feet of that, circular area. Well, then they put another one right over here, and they won't graze within 3 or 4 feet of that, and here and here and here. And all of a sudden, we have this huge patch of grass here that they're not grazing in. And it's because they're trying to avoid parasites. Except now we have what looks like from the road a very nice pasture full of really nice green grass, except they're never going to touch it. And so we have a couple of options, and I think we covered some of this with Dr. Ivy, but a couple of options you look at is trying to drag, trying to break up that manure so it's spread out. And then the key is have an ambient temperature of 85 degrees. If you don't have 85 degrees, it's going to be really hard to kill them. So, but we talked a little bit about this. I don't want to spend too much time covering this aspect unless there's questions for it. But reseeding, I'm pretty sure that we had a few questions on this. So reseeding. So I think the only time to really do any quality reseeding is during the fall. And so if you would have told me this, if I would have told you this last spring, and then we had this perfect spring that we did in a relatively perfect summer, you would have called me a liar. So anybody that would have planted last fall or last March can call me a liar, and they would have been correct. But most times, whether it's competition where the weeds start to come on, spring, we get kind of a spring drought. Summer comes on a little too fast, it heats up. We get more horses out there, whatever it may be. The opportunity for spring grass seeding to have a pretty good success is pretty limited. When you look at fall seeding, that is the best time to get the best return on your investment. And that's only if you do it the correct way, which would be to seed in the fall and then not let them actually see it again until early spring. And really what happens is that grass gets 2 rainy seasons to be able to grow. And so a lot of times, that doesn't work for everybody to be able to pull horses off of it. They have to have some of that for keeping the horses actually on the grounds. So I always look at maybe just trying to break it up and doing it in different patches, not trying to do all at one time. But I just very rarely ever recommend seeding during the spring. You're just not going to get very good success rate. So save your money now and kind of invest it a little bit later. So I keep always referencing back to fall of 2016 as an example, because everybody asks, well, when do you recommend reseeding during the fall? And I throw the typical date out of is October 15th or August 15th, October 1st. And that is a very, very general time, because you got to think about it is, you got to have moisture in the ground, and it's got to be cooling off in the evenings. If you don't have that moisture, you can't plant it into concrete. And so that was what happened in 2016. It didn't rain for 3 months almost, and it was 90 degrees almost every day. And so there's just no way you're going to be able to reseed. Even though we recommended reseeding in the fall, there's just no way you're going to be able to do it. This past fall, it started cooling off in September. We had nice little rains all throughout. And so that was a very good time to be able to reseed. So you got to make sure whenever you go to reseed it that there is some moisture in the ground, because it has to have moisture to grow. And you want to make sure that you continually have some moisture coming so that it will be able to produce and really get going. If you can't remove horses, is it a waste of money to reseed? If you can't remove them from any portion of the ground, then most time, yes, it's a waste of your money to reseed. What I look at is there an opportunity for you to be able to fence off a smaller portion of the land and be able to reseed that, and at least do that in sections over time versus trying to do it all at one time. But in general, if you can't take them off the ground, for the most part, it's going to be you're going to have a very little success rate. If you had 5 acres and you don't ever take them off of it, it'll be hard if they have complete access to that entire 5 acres during all winter, it'll be hard to get very much success rate. If you had 25 acres and you have 5 horses on there, yeah, you'll probably get more success than if you had a very small acreage where they just keep that constant pressure on there. So if you can break it apart and just do it in little sections, that's helpful. And if you have more acres per horse, that would be helpful. But if you're talking about a very small acreage and a bunch of horses, then you'll probably have very little to no success. Okay, so the question is if you decide to drag broadcast seeds and pack, what did she mean by pack? Okay, so what does she mean by pack? So let's get ready to cover that here. I think this next one. So here's kind of some prep work. So what do we need to do as far as to increase our stand percentages, to remove other grasses, kind of weed pressure, or do we do reseeding or a total renovation? Okay. So what they mean by that is if you will, so I'm going to move forward and see if I can. All right. Wasn't sure. So if you will prep the ground the idea is seed has to have contact with the soil. And so I think she talked about that, is you can drag it to create an opportunity for that soil to be open to be able to receive that seed. If I just take seed and throw it out on the ground, very little to any of that is going to actually germinate. So you got to get it actually incorporated into the soil. So you drag it, that can open up the ground a little bit, an opportunity for that soil or that seed to drop into the soil. Some people will aerate depending on how big of a pasture you have. So that seed can be broadcast, it falls in those little holes, and then she comes back. So a lot of times we'll recommend like a drag to come back over the top of that ground to help cover up that seed. So when she says pack it, sometimes people will take a cultipacker or something, a roller or something, to roll back over, and that makes sure that there's good contact with the soil. So it's not fluffed up. It's not like kind of sitting on one little soil particle or a weed particle and not actually touching base with the soil, because the soil moisture is what really initiates the plant to actually start growing. So when they talk about packing it, it's making sure that soil has a good connection with the dirt, or the seed has a good connection with the dirt. So that's what they use by packing. Okay, and we just talked about the these right after control. So is there any weed control after seeding? For the most part, I do not do any weed control unless it be the situation like we had this last fall, where you got to reseed in early September, and by November, December, you can come back in there and do some spraying on those. But you want to wait at least 6-8 weeks at the minimum before you start to do any type of weed control for those. And so, this is what fall reseeding, if it's all done correctly and Mother Nature cooperates, these are some of the things that you can get. It is possible to get good success rate, but patience is the key virtue in all this, and that's sometimes not what all of us have, or have the ability to have. Sometimes you just don't have that, and you can do everything correctly, and Mother Nature doesn't cooperate, and you're in trouble. So one of the best times to evaluate your stand of fescue grass is after that first frost. When you get that first frost, what that does is that kills all the summer grasses. It stops their growth, kills all those summer weeds, stops all their growth. And so they turn immediately brown, and whatever is left that's green is an indicator of what you have as far as cool season. So unfortunately, it becomes a little late to do anything as far as reseeding at that point, but it is a good way to evaluate where you're at so you can prepare for the next year. And so that's how our grasses grow. So the one on the left, that is how it initially starts. Each one of these plants is one plant, one root, and actually one of these can become this whole clump of grass. So it forms a clump, it starts to grow out, forms a clump, and that's as big as that clump will ever get. So when you first throw this out, your horses are grazing on this. So if you immediately put them back out there in the fall, they're stepping on this. This is a very, very sensitive grass plant. What you see above the ground is what kind of root it has below, and it's just one root. It's not a system of roots. Try pulling up one of these versus pulling up this clump of grass. Not possible. So you need to make sure that you can do your best as possible to keep them off of it for as long as possible. So winter wear. We'll finish up with this because I think this is one of the best things you can do, the best investments you can make. They talked a little bit about this, but I'm going to hammer it home even more on this. Best investment you can make on your property. So, this is what happens when you get any type of wear and tear on your pasture. You're getting impaction, erosion, loss of stand, weed pressure. Basically, nothing good happens during the winter on your pasture. So the less you can have horses completely full access to your pasture, the better you'll have success rate for a pasture all throughout the other months. Just nothing good. Only damage occurs during the winter. And so can you improve the pasture in the winter? You can't make it better, but you can prevent harm. So step one is, if you're going to be trying to maintain your pasture, is move it around. Don't concentrate all of your feeding in one area, because that's where you'll start to get a lot of weeds that start to pop up. You'll get a lot of wear and tear on that ground. So spread that damage out. And don't try to feed in the same spot each and every time if you are going to do that. Do some rotational grazing. That's where I often recommend, that's where you can pick one of these paddocks and say, for this winter, this paddock right here is sacrifice. I'm only going to feed here, and I may let them graze here and here on each side of it. They're not going anywhere in these areas right here. That is only for grazing later on. So I know that I'm going to lose value in these because I'm going to concentrate them right here. They're not grazing. They're not getting any nutritional value off these pastures for the most part. And we're just going to concentrate feeding hay right here and doing a little light grazing or light movement, kind of acting of grazing in these few areas. We're going to keep these other areas as best shape that we can. So what can we do? Well, there's the first option is a dry lot, which often, like this winter, becomes a mud lot. You're concentrating all that to right there. That way you're protecting the rest of your pasture. So at the very least, if you can have one area that you do, that's where you do all your feeding and you can pull your horses off of it, then that's where you'll have, be able to protect the rest of the pasture. So, you know, it's not all about what all you do during spring, summer, and fall. It's about what you do during the winter. So you can save a lot of work for the spring, summer, and fall by what you do during that 1 month or 2 months during the winter. So having some sort of dry lot is key. So this would be the first option, or the easiest option, I should say. It's not always the prettiest looking, and horses don't always enjoy walking in the mud just as much as you don't enjoy walking in the mud to feed them out in the middle of this little area. But this is where I can will double down and say best value for your property. Doesn't have to be any bigger than this hay saver hut. Is a heavy use area. It's permeable. You're not walking in mud all the time. Your horse is not standing in mud all the time. It just doesn't have the odor. It doesn't have a lot of the negative appearances, especially if you've got neighbors. Really protects your pasture. It doesn't have to be any bigger. I would say it doesn't have to be any bigger than the area that involves the hay bale, your horse standing, and maybe 2 feet behind your horse. The reason why I say about 2 feet is it allows the manure to drop onto the surface of the heavy use area, easily be cleaned up, and it doesn't create like a mud hole or a cesspool. So it doesn't have to be any bigger than that. You can make it certainly bigger if you want, but that's just the minimum that I would say. You can then you feed your hay there every time. You can clean up that each time very easily, the hay and the manure. Your horses will enjoy standing in it better if they're not standing in mud all the time. You don't have to walk in it. Obviously, the biggest issue is just the initial building of it and the upkeep of it. But it'll be the best return for your dollar, especially in this area. There's just we have more horses than we have in the land, and so every acre that you have, you want to maximize, and this is the best way to do it. So this is typically what I say how to go about building it. Is you want to dig down until you hit some type of hard pan something, whether it's clay, rock. Some of us may have to dig down 12 feet or 12 inches to hit clay. Others have to dig down 2 inches to hit solid rock. Either way, you want to have something. Then you're going to put a geotextile cloth. It's like a very permeable cloth, and you're going to make sure that lays flat on that land or on that surface. So what this does is this gives it a floor. If you don't give it a floor, let's just say it's soft. Let's say you have dirt all the way down to 12 inches, and you dig a hole that is 6 inches. What's going to happen is even if you put that textile on there, it's going to work its way soft because it doesn't have a hard floor. It's got a soft floor. It's going to start working its way down to the hardest part. So when you dig down to that hard pan, it has nowhere to go below that. And the key is you have to put that geotextile cloth. If any of you have applied rock just on top of the ground, you'll have found that after a winter or a year or two, all that rock is gone and you feel like you got to put another whole load of rock in there. Doesn't matter whether it's huge river rock, little pea gravel, whatever it is, it works its way into the ground. So that geotextile cloth keeps its stability there and keeps it from working its way into the soil. So you got to have that geotextile cloth. And so then you put, depending on how deep you're going, 3 to 6 inches of coarse rock, and then you come back on top with 2 to 3 inches of of ground limestone. So what this gives you is it's like a permeable concrete. It's softened up. It's not like horses being on concrete all the time, but it kind of gives that appearance. It's permeable, so you lose a lot of the moisture that wicks right through it. But it's very easy for your horse to stand on. It's easy for you to walk on, and it's easy to clean up. So hands down, best investment. And we've talked a lot about this. Is just each and every time you got to identify a goal that's achievable for you. You don't want to put up an unrealistic goal and then only be setting yourself up for disappointment. But and then the next is consult if desired. I provide everybody my phone number. I think everybody has it, night or day, and you've got my email. I'm always happy to just talk about, even if it's a 5-minute conversation or a 1-minute conversation or a 30-minute. We can talk about what you see going on and how we can address it. You sit here, we can come out there and develop a plan, and we can have a farm visit. And there's just so much that's going to be going on there. It's really hard to take in all of that at one time. So I really encourage you is to have a monthly conversation, have every 2 or 3 months, what you see going on and what you could be doing right now, what you can be doing, getting ready to come forward in the next month or so. And so the only way to really do that is it's really hard to be able to just take all this in and consume it, digest it, and come out with a plan. So be open with that conversation, be open with developing a plan, and then stick to it. It's really hard to be shifting your goals from point A to point B to C, back to A to B, C. So try to get a plan and kind of go with it. So each and every person is different. Each and every farm situation is different. And it's don't expect a one size fits all. So if you talk to your neighbor and they're doing this, doesn't necessarily mean it's exactly going to work for you. It works for them, and it may portions of it may work for you, and others may not. So take advantage. Fire a question off to me at any point in time. Talk to Megan; she can help us out. And so just be out, be open, and come up with a good plan for your farm. And you're not in it alone. That's the important part. So I will stop the share, and then I'll take any questions you guys may have. So thank you guys. We'll talk to you at the next presentation. All right. So I think we have.